Unit 5 in 7th grade is Reading Nonfiction Like a Detective, Investigative Report Writing, Explanations and Arguments. This unit builds on some of the work that students would have done in 6th grade if they were working through these materials, in that it develops this idea of reading like a detective, that the world around us is full of texts, and every text, whether we're talking about a literal text full of the printed word, or we're talking about a TV show, or a film, or an advertisement, texts have multiple levels. There are layers to them, and that we can approach these texts like a detective, read them carefully, and understand more about them, especially what's going on below the surface of the text. So that's the focus of this unit, and the overall structure of this unit we can review using the table of contents. Students begin the unit by reading The Adventure of the Speckled Band, which is a classic Sherlock Holmes story, and we use that text to begin thinking about what detective moves are like. Once we've got a list of detective moves and the kinds of things that a detective does, we use that to build a theory of reading like a detective. What does it look like to read a text in the way that a detective searches for clues? I'll mention here, and I'll mention this again later, just because The Adventure of the Speckled Band is a somewhat longer text with a Sherlock Holmes story, the language being a little Victorian, you might be tempted to slow down and really unpack it. I would say that it's probably good to resist that temptation. You don't need to dig too deeply into The Adventure of the Speckled Band. It's a starting point that serves as a model of detective work. So keep that in mind, and again, I'll talk about that more in a moment. The second part is reading Michael Pollan's My Fast Food Meal Like a Detective. And really there are two sides of this detective question with this text. In one sense, we get to practice reading like a detective using Michael Pollan's text, and we read it on the surface, and we look for his messages below the surface. And then at the same time, we get to think about Michael Pollan's detective work. What is he doing as a writer that allows him to speak in this informed way about his topic? What kinds of moves did he make to gather information and to present it carefully to the reader? Now, having gone through the Sherlock Holmes text and then the Michael Pollan text, we've built this idea of what it is to read like a detective, what that looks like and sounds like. We've practiced it. And now we begin an investigative report of our own. And specifically in this one, students go searching for an ad campaign. They want to gather about 4 or 5 ads that are all about the same product or line of products from a company. And once they've got a set of advertisements to work with, they begin specifically working through multiple parts of this project. The first part involves looking through these advertisements and identifying the surface presentations that are there. What's happening on the surface? What do the images literally show in this advertisement? Things like that. Moving on to the below the surface readings, and students do a below the surface reading of each individual advertisement. Moving on to part 4 of that project, where they consider the ads as a set, and they really analyze, taken together, what are all of these ads saying sort of on the surface, and taken together, what are the messages that are underlying all of these ads together as a set. And the unit concludes with an opportunity for students to share their work and present it either literally as a presentation or potentially as a gallery walk, or one of the alternate methods that are described here. So that's the overview of the unit. Students in this unit are reading informational texts like Michael Pollan's work. They are reading a little bit of fiction, of course, with the Speckled Band. And then they are digging into a very close reading of a set of advertisements. And that set of advertisements can range from print to video advertisements or anything else that students gather together that they submit for your approval. A few quick things to think about in advance while you're planning. One, you want to make sure that students have some way to collect advertisements for part 3 of this unit. And that might just be access to laptops or other technology in your classroom where they can use these to gather those advertisements. But if that's not an option, you might plan in other things like a trip to the school library or time for students to gather advertisements and bring them back as homework, things like that. In particular, you'll want to model some parts of this project with your own work. So think about how you might go about selecting some advertisements for yourself so that you can help guide students through it and then present certain parts of your own work to say, here's what I'm talking about when I say we're going to read these advertisements on the surface. And here's what it looks like to write about what's going on below the surface. So having that in mind is very important. You will want to complete some of this work as a model for students to review. And it does help to create this model yourself. By going through and creating some of this work, you come to understand the kinds of problems your students are going to run into, and you can speak to them very authentically about the ways that you navigated some of those challenges. Here's what I found helpful. Here's what I did when I ran into that. You'll think about the writing tasks, any other kinds of instruction you might want to weave in. There are moments for that throughout this unit. And with that, we can start looking through some of these sessions in more detail. The first 3 sessions, like I mentioned a moment ago, are focused on the Sherlock Holmes story, The Speckled Band, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's a great Holmes story. It's a classic. There are a couple of audio versions and also film versions of it available as well. This is a great opportunity for using an audio version because it is a longer text. So rather than perhaps reading aloud for multiple sections in a day, you might consider making use of the audio texts that are available. And the first work we're doing with this is asking students to follow along with the text and track what's going on in it, in particular key events and characters. And importantly, we want students to observe the significant detective moves that they notice along the way. Remember, we're not analyzing the speckled band in the same way that we would have looked at texts in introduction to argument. Students aren't going to produce some large interpretation of this text for a major grade. We're looking for detective moves. So we can follow along, enjoy the story, and watch what Sherlock Holmes is doing along the way. So we list these things as we're tracking along with the story. And then once we've completed that, we get a chance to spend time going back through it, make sure that we're all on the same page of what's going on in the story. And in session 3, begin forming this idea of reading like a detective. So students take this list of detective moves they've been observing throughout the story, and then they begin to think about what it would mean to read like a detective. So they're exploring this metaphor. If this is what a detective does, what does it mean to read like a detective? That metaphor guides a lot of the work in the unit. So as students build these lists and work on them together, we then come back together as a class and build a whole class list. We revisit that list throughout the unit in different ways. So part 2, we get to put those ideas to the test, and we read Michael Pollan's text, My Fast Food Meal, where he's taking his family to McDonald's and writing about that experience and using that to explore a lot of the larger implications of the sort of industrial food complex that's behind all of that. Now, as a side note, both the Sherlock Holmes story and Michael Pollan's text can be rich sources of vocabulary. So if you have students watching for words that are unfamiliar as they go through both of those texts, you can get a trove of wonderful words to be thinking about and using with vocabulary instruction from our correctness guide. As you read Michael Pollan's text, students watch for important or confusing moments. We capture those together, and we spend session 5 doing some comprehension work where students go back through the story to chunk and retell what is going on in Pollan's text. So they break it into pieces, they get to summarize those moments, they combine those back together to create a walkthrough of literally what's going on in this text. In a way, you could consider this the on-the-surface reading of Michael Pollan's text. We're going to literally identify what he is saying and the order in which he says it. Chunking work is great for comprehension. It really pushes readers to look at the structure of it, look how one idea moves and flows into the next, to summarize and really carefully consider each of those chunks along the way. So you'll see chunking and retelling work somewhat regularly in Inquiry by Design materials. We move from the comprehension work into Michael Pollan's arguments, and in this task, you're looking at a question that might remind you of dealing with difficulty or some of the informational text work. We're thinking about the question, what are Pollan's arguments about fast food? Students have to really unpack what is he saying on the surface and below the surface about fast food. This is a discussion task, so they're not turning this into an extended essay response unless you want them to, which you could do that. But the way that this is written, they get time to work with a partner, go back through the text, carefully consider it, make a set of notes, and come back for a whole class discussion about that topic. And in doing so, we get to practice reading beneath the surface of a text, reading like a detective. In session 7, we take a moment to more closely examine Michael Pollan's methods in his writing. So when I said a moment ago that we look at Michael Pollan's text and we both read it like a detective, and we also examine his detective-like moves, this is the shift toward that second part of that. Students go back through Michael Pollan's text, looking for how he's using information, the way he writes about it, where he seems to be gathering the information from, and what kinds of questions he's asking. How does he put this back together for the reader? So they're given this task to complete, and session 8 allows time to wrap up that work. At the end of session 8, students get a chance to share their work with others, present it, post it in the classroom, and students can walk through the class to compare the different works that other groups did on their charts. Students get a chance to reflect on that work and think about what it means to read like a detective again, and also think about what have they learned about that in going through the work with Michael Pollan's text that adds to what they were thinking after reading the Sherlock Holmes text. Part 3 introduces the project that forms the basis of the remainder of the unit. And we give students time to read through the overview of the project, to talk about it in groups, and then to come back and discuss the project as a whole class, to walk through some of the different components of it. Each of the different parts of this project gets dedicated class time. But in this class, we're introducing it, and the work that students will do is they will select and gather advertisements, and they will read this advertising campaign like a detective. So they'll identify a company or product, select about 4 to 6 different ads for that product, and then review them on the surface and below the surface individually and as a set. That's a lot of work, so that's why we've broken it down into different parts that students get specific class time to complete. So they'll complete it in sections throughout the rest of this unit. Now, most of us have probably found at times that the hardest part of any kind of project like this is just getting started, getting ideas for even where to look, what to think about. So session 9 really gives us the opportunity to help students brainstorm what kinds of advertisements might I even be looking at. We've all seen insurance ad campaigns, shoe campaigns, video games, cars, restaurants. There are a lot of ideas out there, and they're not going to always come immediately to mind. So we spend some time with students brainstorming them. We can help seed some of their thinking with a list like this, or we can just start as a whole class brainstorming and jump off from the different ideas that come up. You'll want to think about a set of advertisements that you might use in modeling your own work. So you might say, throughout the project, I'm going to be doing mine with some of these Allstate campaigns. I'm going to be looking at these ads that all feature the Mayhem character, and I'll be looking at my on the surface and below the surface presentations that I can share with you. After brainstorming, students get time to select and gather. We dedicate class time for that. And then part 2 of the project has students considering literally what's happening on the surface of the advertisements. What is it selling? What's literally going on? Who are the people in it? What are they doing? What's the setting, etc. You can look for other details. There's more that could be done with that, but that's the basic idea of it. And students write up a little bit of this information for each advertisement. And there are different ways they can do it. They can literally write that out. For example, if they had a print advertisement that they pasted onto a document and they wrote out that information below it, that's fine. That's one way that they could do that. But there are some other creative ways that you could do this re-presentation work. Students could create a time-stamped video, They could record an audio description of the advertisement that conveys this information. They could even lay that over the video itself, so they're sort of voicing over the advertisement and explaining what's going on the surface. There are a lot of different ways you could approach it, and we can involve students in thinking through that process. And we get a session to wrap up that work. Part 3 introduces the below the surface readings of the text. And in this section, we want students to begin thinking like a detective. What's going on in this advertisement that isn't right there on the surface? That's more than just literally what's being said out loud. So we're thinking like a detective, and we might be considering questions like, what does this advertisement seem to imply about the people in the ad? What does it seem to say about the kind of person who might want to buy this product? Who's the target audience for this advertisement? And I want to point out that these are excellent critical questions. We want our students to be able to navigate the world asking these kinds of questions, because we want to be critical readers of texts, especially texts that are also trying to read us, texts that are trying to shape our experiences in the world, like advertisements. So these are great skills. I love having this work in our units. They continue that work in session 14 and 15, reading the advertisements below the surface. You'll want to have advertisements that you can talk through to help model some of this thinking. And you can model that thinking with different types of advertisements. So one might be an image, one might be a video that you watch with students on another day, things like that. And session 16 is one where we then work with students to collaborate in creating a written response to a below the surface question. What we're doing is taking the notes that we've created over the previous sessions in those brief modeling moments where we're looking through an advertisement together. We collect notes from those and we turn it into a brief 200 to 300 word below the surface write-up that serves as a model for students. And honestly, 200 words is not very long. Students will imagine that it is very long, but it goes by very quickly when you have just a few questions to answer about an advertisement. So session 16 allows us to collaborate with students in building a model of this kind of writing. And we're modeling this together so that students can see an example of how to take the notes they would have been gathering about their advertisements and the below the surface messages and turn those notes into a brief, coherent response in writing to that advertisement. Session 17 introduces part 4, reading the ads as a set. And the move here is from an individual on the surface and below the surface reading of each separate advertisement to an analysis of what all of the ads together seem to be saying. So what are the kinds of things we see on the surface of each advertisement? And what are the kinds of things we see going on below the surface of all of these advertisements taken together as a set? So they will have a lot of material from what they have already written that they can draw on. This isn't necessarily a ton of new information. It's about synthesizing the ideas that they have been working through in the earlier parts of the task. So they read the advertisements as a set on the surface and below the surface, and then they complete task 2, where they critique the advertisements. And they decide, is this compelling or not? What is counterproductive or not compelling in this set of advertisements? What's working or not working, and how? For session 18, once again, you'll want to have some part of your own work that you can share with students as a model of how this kind of work can be done, how you can take together notes from different advertisements and say something about all of them together as a set, so that students can continue to work on this part of the assignment in their groups. There's some great opportunities to tie into our writing resources, and then session 19 moves into the presentation part of the work, where we can begin creating either a PowerPoint or a poster or some other shareable sample of our work. And we can either prepare for a stand-up presentation or a more gallery walk type approach to the work. That draws the unit to a close. And as always, I want to emphasize the closing meeting of the final session, where students have the opportunity to reflect on the unit as a whole and consider the questions about reading like a detective that have guided all of this work. What does it tell us about texts? What does it teach us about being readers? How have our ideas about this changed over the course of the unit? So that's reading like a detective at 7th grade.